so that's where
So it gets down to then what is the public-private relationship? Is it fair on the scale of an annual basis?
So we can debate that right now.
I guess they are.
All right, I think we're ready. Hi, I'm Cheryl Banks, marketing manager for the library. Thanks for coming. Oh no, it's my pleasure. My pleasure. I can get you some. Sure. It'll be cut. Sure. Okay. Yeah, let me just introduce everything and then I'll go again. Good evening. My name is Cheryl Banks. I'm the Marketing and Community Relations Manager at the Cleveland Heights University Heights Public Library. Welcome everyone this evening to our public forum. One of the missions of a public library is to encourage an open exchange of ideas, so I'm so pleased we're hosting this public forum about sports stadium financing in Ohio, sponsored by the League of Women Voters, Cleveland.com, and Case Western Reserve University. I'm also pleased to introduce tonight's moderator, Peter Krouse. Peter Krouse is a public interest and public advocacy reporter with Cleveland.com. Prior to that, he was an editorial writer and member of the Northeast Ohio Media Group / Plain Dealer Editorial Board. And altogether, Peter has been with Cleveland.com and the Plain Dealer for over 16 years. He is also a graduate of the University of Richmond. So, ladies and gentlemen, Peter Krouse.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming. One thing we can all agree on is that we love our Cleveland sports teams. We pull for them in good times and bad, and this last June we experienced the epitome of good when the Cavaliers won a world championship and delivered the first title in the city since 1948. When the Indians won a World Series. And then just here in November, I can't believe I'm saying November when I'm talking baseball, that's a topic for another discussion, but in November we almost won the World Series. Of course, we lost in Game 7. And what a thrill it was, right? I mean, we all absolutely enjoyed rooting for the Indians, rooting for the Cavs. And we have the Browns. And okay, they're not doing very well, but they're still the beloved Browns, and they probably always will be, even though they're not doing too well right now. But one thing that all three of these teams do have in common is they all play in arenas that are publicly owned and in large part paid for with public money. In all instances, which we'll find out, the owners have put millions of their own money into these facilities, but I think it's safe to say that if not for the taxpayer, most of these facilities would not have been built, and possibly one, two, or maybe all three of our teams might not be here. So we're blessed with a three-team city, but it's safe to say that we are also a small market, and that is to suggest that you know, if we were all starting over again, we wouldn't have three major league teams, and I think that plays a part in this whole discussion. So in that vein, what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about publicly financing stadiums. Should it be done? If so, how much and how? And we've got a great panel here this evening with a great deal of knowledge and a great deal of passion This isn't a debate, okay? So everything's going to be civil. This is going to, information purposes, you all be asked to provide some questions as well. But let me introduce our panel. And somehow I lost Tom Chema. Used to be the president of Hiram College, but more significant to tonight, you were the executive director back in the 90s of the Gateway Development Corporation, and which brought baseball and basketball to the Gateway District of Cleveland. Next to Tom is Len Komoroski, who is the CEO of the Cavaliers. And Len, how long have you been with the Cavaliers?
Since 2003.
Since 2003, okay. And then next to Len is Peter Pattakos, who is a lawyer with the Chandra Law Group. And Peter's got some views on publicly financing of stadiums, and I think we'll have a good balance and a good discussion. But to get it all started, let's first turn to Tom. Tom, give us a little bit a lay of the land. Take us back to the 1990s. What stadiums did we have, and how did we get to where we are now?
I tend to talk a lot. I like the sound of my own voice, so when I overdo it, cut me off.
Okay.
First, thank you for inviting me to participate. It's been a decade since I've been involved in one of these forums, although have over time been involved in them in probably 44 different cities around the United States, starting with Cleveland in the late 80s, early 90s. In the 80s, two brothers, Dick and David Jacobs, acquired the Cleveland Indians, and virtually from the time that they acquired the team for the next at least 5 or 6 or 7 years, there were folks from Florida trying to get them to move the team from Cleveland to the St. Petersburg area. And they were very tempted because they had an awful deal in the one stadium that we had in Cleveland, which was the Municipal Stadium at the lakefront. In 1974, the mayor of Cleveland, Ralph Perk, leased that stadium to Art Modell Stadium Corporation for the wonderful sum of $250,000 a year. Mr. Modell in turn turned around and charged the Cleveland Indians $2.5 million per year to sublet the building for baseball, and he dominated most of the revenue stream. So the Indians didn't get any revenue from suites in the building. They didn't get revenue from any but the day of game advertising in the building. They even had to share their merchandising and concession revenue with Modell. So they basically wandered in the desert for 30 years because they couldn't make enough money to buy good players. And the Misters Jacobs were very inclined to stay in Cleveland, but they kept getting all these offers to move. And in order to stay in Cleveland, they needed a new venue with a new deal. In addition to the Cleveland Municipal Stadium, where the Browns and the Indians played, we had an arena, but it was in Richfield, halfway more or less between Akron and Cleveland. It was privately owned by the Gunn brothers. It had been built in 1974 by Nick Maletti, and it passed through a couple hands before the Gunn brothers got it. They were doing quite well in Richfield. The team did well. Some of you may remember the Miracle of Richfield, and the Gunns actually made more money on parking at Richfield than they did on what happened in the building. It was a pretty nice relationship for them. In the late 80s, the business community and the political community became very concerned that the Indians would in fact move. In the mid-80s, that concern stimulated an effort to build a dome stadium that failed in the mid-80s and resurrected itself in the 1989 period. In May of 1989, Dick Celeste was governor of Ohio, and he asked me if I would help him keep the Indians from moving to Florida. And that meant getting a new ballpark. So I was commissioned by the governor to try to come up with a plan that would be acceptable to the Indians, to the business community, to the political powers that be, the city of Cleveland and the county, as well as the state, to keep the Indians by getting them a new building. Came up with this idea of a tax on beer, wine, cigarettes, and alcohol. Tried to get your plain dealer to call that a luxury tax, but you insisted on calling it a sin tax. The political community generally approved of that as a vehicle for going forward. We had to get the General Assembly to pass a law allowing the county to impose this sin tax. Then we had to get the county commissioners to put it on the ballot. And it had to be countywide, not citywide, because the city didn't have enough economic base to allow for the kind of dollars that were necessary to build the facility that we had anticipated. Then we had to get the public to vote for this, and by a very narrow margin. I think the margin was something like 1.2%, but somebody like Jeff can probably tell you exactly what it was. But it was a very narrow win. In fact, during the course of that campaign, we never had a poll that showed us winning that, but on Election Day, a few more people, primarily from the suburbs, came out and supported the issue. And primarily young people came out and supported the issue, and it won. Like Donald Trump, we woke up the next day and said, what do we do now? And what we did now was create an entity called the Gateway Economic Development Corporation of Greater Cleveland. Having talked the governor, the mayor, and the commissioners into doing this in the first place, they decided I would be on the limb with them, and they made me the executive director of that entity. That was a private, not-for-profit corporation that had members that were the city and the county. It didn't have any owners per se. The board was appointed by the mayor and the county commissioners, and there was a joint appointee of there was a 9-member board, a joint appointee of the 9th member, and that entity was charged with taking the revenue from the sin tax, developing other revenue streams, entering into leases with the Indians and the Cavs, and I'll come back to how the Cavs got into this in a second. Hiring architects, hiring contractors, selling naming rights, soup to nuts, putting a stadium in place, or a new ballpark and an arena in place, and getting that in a position where in 1994, we could have opening day with the Indians, and in April and October of '94, opening day with the Cavs. Ownership of the Indians at the time were the Jacobs brothers. The Cavs were owned by the Guns. The facility was and is owned by the Gateway Economic Development Corporation of Greater Cleveland, this not-for-profit that owns the land that it's on and owns the buildings.
But aren't they, in essence, owned by the city and the county?
Well, as I said, they don't have owners. They have members, and the members are the city and the county, yes. Okay.
Is there a distinction between that? I mean, that's
Sure.
significant.
That's very similar to lots of not-for-profit entities that operate in the place of government but aren't government. There's actually a specific category within the Internal Revenue Code, 501c8, I think. Kind of forgotten exactly the section. But yes, it is important. It's an important distinction that it wasn't the government owning it. It was a proxy for the government owning this. Now, we operated, not to Raldo's satisfaction most of the time, but in a very public way. We had public board meetings. We complied with our version, because we didn't have to comply with the state's version of the public record law, but we basically had a public record disclosure provision. We bid the contracts. We followed generally accepted government accounting practices and procurement practices.
And did the owners of the Jacobs or Who owned the Cavs at that time? Was it the Gunn?
The Gunn brothers.
The Gunn
owned
brothers.
Cavs, yes.
Did they put money into those original stadiums?
Oh, yes. They put a lot of money into the original stadiums. The total cost of the project, the ballpark, the arena, and the 2 garages that were built and the common areas, the total cost of that was $461 million. About 56% of that was public dollars coming from the sin tax and also a grant that the state of Ohio made. And the balance of that was private money that the teams put in. Some of it was $25 million was money that Dick Jacobs and Gordon Gunn personally put in to buy the original naming rights. There were other private dollars from entities like a now non-existent group called Cleveland Tomorrow. They put in a couple million. The Cleveland Foundation put in some dollars, and there were various and sundry other sources of private revenue. But at the end of the day, that $461 million, about 56% of that was public dollars and 44% private dollars, which was one of the early first and I would say model deals in the country. Prior to what we did in Cleveland, virtually all of these kinds of public infrastructure buildings, ballparks, arenas, stadiums, for millennia, they had been funded, financed, owned, and operated by the public. You go back to the Greeks and Romans, and these kind of buildings have traditionally been considered public infrastructure. And the public generally bought and paid for them and owned them and operated them. There have been 2 aberrations from that public ownership. One was in the United States in the 1910 to 1925 period, the progressive era. Then we just basically had professional baseball. But the robber barons who owned the baseball teams didn't want to be under the thumb of the progressive mayors, the La Follettes and that group, the LaGuardias, so they built their own stadiums. They didn't want public funding and financing, and that didn't turn out so well. We might get back to that.
Well, hold on a second. All right, well, that's the lay of the land then for the Cavs and for the Indians, and we'll shorthand a little bit with the Browns. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Art Modell wanted a new stadium in '95. He and the Mike White administration couldn't reach an agreement, and Modell decided to take his team to Indianapolis, and we then got an expansion Browns team back in 1999.
That's shorthand and generally accurate, but if I could fill in a few blanks. Originally, with the Gateway Project, the original idea was to do a ballpark and stadium. It was going to be both the Indians and the Cavs playing in a multi-use facility. Art Modell told me in the fall of 1989 that he did not want to play unless he could have the same deal in the new stadium that he had in the Cleveland Municipal Stadium. And I've already outlined for you what that deal was. That was easy no for us because we had to build this building to allow the Indians to generate some revenue so that they could continue to be here and hopefully be successful. So Art opted out, and that's how the Cavs came into the equation. Originally, as I said, this was going to be a ballpark and football stadium. When it was only a ballpark, we decided to reach out to the Cavs and see if we could induce them to move the arena downtown, because we reasoned that a ballpark and an arena together could have significant economic development impact on downtown Cleveland that just building a new ballpark wouldn't. If you have something that's going to attract people 365 as opposed to from April to September, or if you get lucky, October, you have much better opportunity to have spin-off development, bars, restaurants, retail, What we didn't really think about, but happened in spades, was the housing boom that hit very quickly after the ballpark and the arena opened along Prospect and East 4th and Huron roads. That we really had not anticipated. Modell opts out. He sits on the sideline. He, like most of the Clevelanders, didn't really believe we could pull this off and build these two buildings. So I think he was sitting on the sidelines waiting for this to fail. He didn't do anything to undermine it, but he was not helping. And then when he was very surprised that it succeeded, and he was extremely surprised that a huge number of people in the business community wanted to buy suites in this ballpark and this arena, and that we substantially exceeded what we thought we could do in terms of the sale of those facilities. And he came to Mayor White shortly after the ballpark opened in April of '94 and said, okay, you got a great ballpark, and I now gather you're going to finish this arena, and that'll be a great building. What are you going to do for me? He didn't say he wanted a new building. He said he wanted to repair Cleveland Municipal Stadium, and he wanted us to spend $79 million to do three things: improve the suites, put a new scoreboard in place, and he wanted to take out poles in the lower seating deck so that people would have better views. Now, this was not I think Art, by that time, had kind of lost touch of his own business. This didn't pencil. The revenue that he would have earned from those improvements, he would have lost in the 9,700 seats that would have come out of the building to accommodate the poles coming out. So we suggested to him that that was not a great thing to do and that we ought to look at other options. He then gets induced by Baltimore to take his talents elsewhere, and he did in 1995.
And let's start from right there, where he was induced by Baltimore to take his team there. Is it right for an owner of a sports team to be able to essentially leverage the loyalty of a community? It sounds like when it comes right down to it, everything here is a negotiation. In other words, what can the owner get from the city or the county? What can the city or the county get from the owner? And if neither one, if a deal can't be reached, well, there's this third party that we can turn to. I mean, that seems to be the model that's used time and time again throughout this country. And Peter Pattakos, let me ask you, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, does it all come down to just one big negotiation? I mean, or is there a pattern? Is there a model that communities should follow when it comes to financing these public arenas?
Well, you would hope that it would always be a negotiation when you're talking about a public-private partnership like this. My position is simply this. I really liked when Tom was talking about the Greeks in the old days when the public owned the facilities as well as the franchises, because in those situations the public was also taking the profit from these enterprises. And again, my position simply is that if the owners of Cleveland's professional sports franchises are going to take 100% of the profits from running these businesses, they should pay 100% of the costs. I might feel differently about this if the owners could make the case that they really need public money to make these businesses sustainable, but they cannot begin to make this case until they publish their financial statements. And their continued refusal to disclose their profits it tells us that there's really not a open, fair, transparent negotiation going on here. And that, to me, is the biggest problem. I don't question that the pro sports teams are good for the community, even though study after study does show that they do not create an economic benefit, and if anything, create a liability, as we're seeing in St. Louis right now, where they just have a disaster on their hands. I also understand, again, that the city and county own these facilities and that there are technically legal obligations to maintain them. But these obligations were agreed to 3 decades ago under dramatically different economic conditions, on terms that are now understood to be extremely favorable to the owners and unfavorable to the public.
Is the little green light on your mic?
No.
Go to the tab where it says push.
Got it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So, as I said, these obligations were agreed to 3 decades ago under dramatically different economic conditions on terms that are now understood to be extremely favorable to the owners and extremely unfavorable to the public. So at this point, given changed economic conditions and so many pressing problems, there's no reason why the public shouldn't demand that the terms of this public-private partnership be revisited, especially considering that we've poured at least $1 billion and probably upwards of $2 billion into these franchises already. Now, should the public make this demand properly through empowered elected representatives, which we have not seen in recent days, for various reasons that I think opens up an interesting conversation that is separate from this in a way. It would be impossible, at least for me, to imagine that the owners would risk their goodwill by continuing to refuse basic transparency, accountability, and fairness in this partnership. And that is simply what I'm suggesting the public should demand from its relationship with these teams. Transparency, accountability, and fairness, which has to start with these teams providing the public with the most basic information necessary to determine whether these public subsidies are really necessary. And I think if we were able to have this basic information, a number of good things would happen from there, starting with the public's ability to combat the threat that any one of these teams would leave Cleveland if they didn't get a certain level of public subsidy. And when I refer to the public here, I'm referring to citizens across the country who have been rejecting these subsidies at the ballot box with increasing frequency, as we saw most recently in San Diego, where voters just rejected a ballot measure to increase taxes to pay for the Chargers, to keep the Chargers in town, even in the face of the imminent threat that they will leave town. And the bigger point here is that I think uprooting these franchises from the communities where they are so important is becoming an increasingly unacceptable proposition. And I think at this point, it's well known what the metropolitan areas are that can support these professional franchises, I think, and you can just see it by looking at the TV markets. And you can call Cleveland a small market in a way, but in a way it's really not. In a way, there is, it's around the 15th biggest metropolitan statistical area. As we know, people are watching these teams in Columbus, they're watching them in Akron, they're watching them in Youngstown, they're watching them all over the region, and it is a heavily populated region. And I think that the leagues themselves understand that Cleveland is a place where they want to have these pro sports teams. So I think that that's a good fact to keep in mind in evaluating this partnership and whether this is a negotiation that the public is really getting a fair shake in.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Let me ask you, do the Cavs keep 100% of its profits?
Well, first of all, thanks for having us all here in terms of the League of Women Voters, Cleveland.com, and having this type of dialogue. Maybe if I can just try to give some context here. I know Tom had spoke to a bit of it on a macro level, and I know, Peter, respect your thoughts here as well, but we operate, as does any team in a major professional level, on a national landscape. And we have 30 markets in the NBA. We're the 19th largest television market, DMA, which is really the judgment in terms of how these markets are measured. We're the 20th largest market in the NBA, just by virtue of teams in LA, New York, multiple teams, and also Toronto, which if we're in the U.S., it'd be the 6th largest market in the U.S. So just given that bit of context here, but as it pertains to, as you look at this in terms of the public-private partnership, you get to the question of how does that relate on a national scale, and I guess you could ask the question, have our public officials been good stewards of taxpayers' money in terms of the decision of these facilities and having relationships with pro sports teams in the marketplace? I think from our perspective, and certainly I'm not from this area, having been from a number of different markets, and there's been an exceptional job done by, I think, our stewards here in forging, which in our case, we have the most public-friendly lease of any comparable market in the NBA in terms of mid and small markets. So in other words, we put more privately into the queue than any other of those comparable markets throughout the league. And so as you look at that, so you have a function of a lease in terms of investment in those lease, dollars that go in for operations, for repair and maintenance, for capital expenses. In this case, we have the unique aspect of our landlord as well with Gateway and their expenses too, that all factor into the mix. And so in the case of the queue, as an example, when you look at that, and again, as you judge that on a national landscape, we pay for 100% of the operational costs. We pay for the repair and maintenance cost associated with this public entity facility. We also pay for a large portion of the capital repairs. In fact, until recently, 100% of that, upwards of $100 million or $400 million privately invested in the queue as a whole. And then based on the evolution of time in 2004, during a period when Gateway could not meet its own needs from a funding perspective for the common areas, the property tax, insurance, and otherwise, the teams being the Cavaliers and the Indians got together and actually now, in the unique circumstance on a national landscape, actually pay our landlord's expenses. So the Indians and the Cavs are paying for property taxes, insurance, for the actual operations of the Gateway Corporation, the common area, and its staff as well. So another unique aspect. So within that construct of a lease, you have those obligations that are taking place, and then you have revenues that are derived. And on an aggregate basis, while we derive revenue certainly from that, you have to look at it in the context of all those components together and the function of the lease. And the Cavaliers and the Q and our ownership, Dan Gilbert, Nate Forbes, Jeff Cohen, invest more privately in the Q as a facility than any other comparable market in our league.
And I think that's kind of what I was getting to when I said, do you keep 100% of your profits? I mean, what you're saying then is that a large percentage of your revenues are put back into the operations, expenses, maintenance, different things like that. Can you give us a percentage? In other words,
you know, it's really not a matter of percentage. It's more of a matter of, I think, again, looking on that national landscape and then judging. And I think this is something the community's made judgments on in terms of the very beginning about, is it a fair partnership or not? We have a public-private partnership as a construct.
Is there a model for a fair partnership?
Well, I would say this: there's when I would say this, I think, and Tom could speak this probably much more greater, as he's been involved representing municipalities on a large scale across the country with these. And I think Tom spoke well. And I knew of the Gateway project being in Philadelphia, where I was prior to here, because the Gateway project in and of itself has become a model around the country where you can use these type of public assets, these sports facilities, and how can they serve catalytic impact for a marketplace. So if you look at Gateway, and we're talking about Gateway itself, you have a scenario where you had the area of least investment in the city of Cleveland. There was no residential, no hotels, 4 eateries, which is code for being open for lunch. And now you have, flash forward now, 20 years later, you have over $1 billion of development. You have the largest residential district in downtown Cleveland. You have 9 hotels. You have over 70 restaurants, and the prospect of hundreds of millions or more in investment in the Gateway District with projects such as Nucleus.
But you can't pin all that on Gateway and on the sports facilities. In fact, there was, I think, a story just came out the other day. I think Forbes, a lot of other places, publications have been coming into Cleveland due to our success this year and looking at the situation. And they're saying that, and even not Dan Gilbert, but David Gilbert, who heads Sports Authority, is saying that the success of downtown Cleveland is not because of the sports teams. It's because of a lot of other things that have been going on. I would contend that the sports teams are certainly part of it. But how can we say that the community is getting more out of this public-private partnership than the owners of the teams, and as some would say, the billionaire owners of the teams?
Well, I would say, first of all, just going back to that, absolutely, there's been tremendous number of great things happening in downtown Cleveland. I'm speaking to the Gateway District, and if I just would suggest that if not for the Gateway project, I doubt that the Gateway District would be where it is today. I know you could probably venture a thought there too, Tom, as it relates to that. But again, this is being done over and over and over again on a national basis, where you use these type of projects to be anchors. Think of it like a mall. You got these anchor tenants, these anchors, who then attract additional investment that otherwise wouldn't necessarily take place. To your point, to maybe to the scale or the degree that has taken place. And then the other point about this is, so you not only have the economic impact, not only from the venues themselves, which in the case of the Q, which is actually through an economic impact study that's been published in the Plain Dealer, over $4 billion of economic impact through the Q, upwards of $500 million of tax impact. Even this past year, $285 million of economic impact, $36 million of state and local taxes generated through the Q. And so you have that subset. But then I would also say, and this is a big part of it as well, is there's not only the tangibles of that type of impact, the tangibles of development, which when you look at the Gateway District, there has been substantial development. Above and beyond that, though, are all the intangibles. I think hopefully what we've seen this past year has been a great example of how these entities help bring communities together. We've had and in terms of changing the dialogue on Cleveland on an international scale, so when you look at this, we had the NBA Finals, 215 countries broadcasting that, as well as in 47 different languages, over upwards of 1 billion people seeing Cleveland in an incredibly positive light. And what we've seen is a dialogue starting to change on Cleveland. But even beyond that, and this is about the Q, I want to talk to this about the Q even as it relates to this. The Q, Quicken Loans Arena, is Cleveland's living room. So it is a facility that our community marketers, beyond what we have going on, in the 200 plus events we have, and ticketed events, 550 non-ticketed events, but in attracting events and activities, whether it be the NCAA tournaments, the Mid-American Conference tournament, or the RNC, which otherwise would not have been able to happen. So our community marketers, working with the Sports Commission, working with Destination Cleveland, the Greater Cleveland Partnership, we have a venue that enables us to be able to compete on a national basis for events that truly do make an impact. And I'll use, again, an example with the RNC. Here was an event that in Tampa, over $400 million of economic impact in Tampa. I know there's a study going on here for Cleveland now. The second largest media event in the world. 15,000 media were here. And you know who the winner was for the RNC, for the convention? It was Cleveland. On a national and international scale, of that 15,000 media who came here, I would tell you 14,800 of them hadn't been to Cleveland before. And they came away saying, what's the amazing things about Cleveland? And so we're seeing a sea change happening about national and international opinion about our city, which has a residual effect that goes beyond dollars and cents.
I don't think anybody would argue with that the Cleveland has seen an incredible year. In fact, when Time Magazine comes out with its Person of the Year, it should be Cleveland, because it's just been a phenomenal year. And obviously, the Cavs are a huge part of that. The Indians and those arenas and the Gateway and everything. I don't think anybody can deny that. Mm-hmm. I guess what the question though is to what extent should the taxpayer be involved in that versus strictly private development? And I asked, and I'm asking that.
Can I weigh in on that?
Yes,
Peter? I think
please.
that's a very good question, and that is, I think, a key question in all of these debates. And part of the issue is whether you believe that ballparks, stadiums, arenas, convention centers, and the like are public infrastructure. If your answer to that is no, they're not, they're something that some private person ought to do, well, then you come up with a conclusion that public dollars ought not be spent. I will, and I think always will argue that these facilities are public infrastructure, just like roads and bridges and waterways and sewers. None of those things pay for themselves. The reason we have roads is so you can do all kinds of economic activity and all kinds of fun things and whatever to get from point A to point B, but that road doesn't pay for itself. We as taxpayers pay for the roads. The same thing is true with bridges, same thing is true with water and sewer and everything that we consider public infrastructure. I think that it makes perfectly good sense for the public to participate in a very big way in funding public infrastructure, in large part because you wouldn't have the opportunity to do all those other things if you didn't have that infrastructure in the first place. Of course, I'm prejudiced. I think that, in fact, the Gateway Project was the catalytic moment in modern Cleveland history that allowed for all these good things that have happened in the succeeding 25 years to happen. It wasn't the only reason, for sure. Might not have even been the biggest reason, but it certainly was the catalytic reason.
But I think to Peter's point, though, is we're a different time now. And
we stand on the shoulders of those who went before us. You have to have the entirety of this history is part and parcel of this issue.
No, I know, but do you still need the same level of public investment, I guess?
Well, you don't have the same level of public investment now. You have a much reduced level of public investment in these buildings.
The difference between these buildings and other public infrastructure like roads, bridges, water systems, and et cetera, is that with respect to those other public infrastructure, the public takes whatever profits are there from that infrastructure. The public takes the money from the toll booths. Whereas what we have here is the public is paying for what some people want to call public infrastructure when it comes to these stadiums, and we have these private individuals who are taking the profits directly from them, and the public has no idea what amount of profit is being taken out to justify the subsidy. And I think that's really what this comes down to. I don't want to question how great these teams are, how good they are for Cleveland, how good they are for the community, because it's beside the point. And I think it's interesting that these gentlemen keep wanting to go back to that point. Because again, the question is, as great as these teams might be for the region, why does the public need to be paying for it at all when they are not taking the profit out of it? And I would like to respond to Len's point about the leases, and to say that the city of Cleveland, or to say that the Cavaliers have one of the leases that is the most favorable to the public among mid-market and small market teams. How do you even begin to evaluate that if you don't know what profit these other teams are making, and if the public can't see what profit the Cavaliers are making? I don't know how we can begin to evaluate that. I don't know how Len can even say it either, unless he is privy to the private books of all of these other teams. He may be, but the public here certainly is not. So I would like to focus the discussion on not how good these teams are for the region or what they do for the region, but rather why the public needs to pay for it.
Well, I think it's all wrapped up. No, but before I got to get one thing in here before it gets too late, and I want to go to you, Len, because
you can ask it, but Peter had asked a question which is very easy to answer. So I think maybe just to clarify that point, the question being is, well, how can you even judge if these are a good deal for publicly or privately? How you judge that is based off of the lease. These are public assets, whether it be here, whether it be in Indianapolis, whether it be in Memphis, whether it be, I can go on and on and on. So these are public, you have these public facilities. Then you have teams who have leases. And then the base of that is the economic terms of that lease. You may have certain communities where it's 100% publicly financed, going back to Tom's point about the 56-44 equation when these were built, where you have them 100% publicly financed, and then you have cases like that where the economic terms, which you call occupancy cost, so that's related to rent, that's related to operations and maintenance and repair and maintenance and capital expenses and all those. Those are the economic terms associated with that, and then with that is who are paying for those type of dollars. And in this case, the judgment being, so we could look at certain markets, and they're all out there, where in the cases of the operating cost are in certain cases borne by the public, all the repair and maintenance costs, all the CapEx, all of those type of scenarios. In our case, and that's why I say, so when you line up all these different communities in these different markets, line up those leases, and you were to look at those, who is investing what. In our case, we are investing in terms of this public-private partnership more than any comparable market in the league. So I just wanted,
percentage-wise?
no, I'm talking about pure dollars.
Okay, well, it
Dollars
should
and
probably
components.
be looked at more appropriately from a percentage, should it not?
No, well, either way, 100% of something is a percentage. Okay, so we're paying 100% of the operating cost, 100% of the repair and maintenance cost. We're paying a large portion of the capital repairs, and and on top of that, we're also paying unprecedented within these different markets are 100%, well, 50% more accurately, because the Indians are paying the other 50% of our landlord's costs. So whether it be dollars or percentage, they're at levels that are greater than any comparable market in our league.
Let's look at the syntax real quickly. That was renewed for the third time back in 2014. It goes for 20 years. That brings in about $13 million a year. So that's about $260 million over the next 20 years. The County Executive Armin Budish has suggested that be split evenly between the teams, and that money is largely for maintenance, large maintenance projects over 500,000
Major capital.
Major capital repairs, and so the Cavs will be getting their share of that. If you guys received any of that already, I'm not sure.
Well, so let me, which is a great question here.
But I wanted to, let me, before you answer that,
Okay.
What I wanted to get you to talk about a little bit is maybe the next round of public financing here, because the syntax is in place for a while. And I know the Cavs, you guys have plans for something you'd like to do, pretty dramatic plans around the Q and that area in terms of renovating that area, kind of putting a new facade on things. It's my understanding that it's about $120 or $140 million investment, and I think, from what I understand, the Cavs would like the county to pay half of that. I don't think any of the details of this have come out very publicly yet. We had a conversation with Armin Budish the other day, and he said that it may, by the end of the year, there should be a plan that's made public between the Cavs and the county about what you guys want to do there. Can you enlighten us a little bit as to what's going on?
Well, I think first off, we're always working with our partners at the city, the county, Gateway, as to how we can keep the Q competitive on a national landscape, not only for the past 23 years we've had, but also looking at the long term. So we're always in discussion with them as to how we're able to make that happen. If you look at it in terms of our current state, we have a building this past year, which Polestar is a measure of live entertainment activity on a national, international basis. The Q was the 13th most active arena in the country, and given 6 or 7 of those venues are in New York and LA, we're outperforming our market by a significant margin. We're the 33rd most active arena in the world.
Doesn't that mean there's even less of a need for public money, Len?
And just maybe if I can answer Peter's question
that's a
here.
good point, though.
So, but as far as, so you have a building that's performing at a very high level. It's also a building that is, as we're able to compete in a ever increasing competing marketplace on a national scale relative to other venues and other markets that are out there, whether it be concerts, whether it be events like the RNC, which we were fortunate enough to be able to get, or NCAA tournaments, or the UFC, which we had our first ever event in our history, and Stipe Miocic was able to defend his title here in Cleveland, yet another title that was taking place here. So the whole essence of it is that's basically the crux of the discussion with that, and we're in those. We are always engaged in those type of discussions. At this point, there's really not much more to say about it, because there is nothing specific to go to.
Point about other needs. Armin Budish has come out and said that there really is no room to borrow money anymore. The county is tapped out. There are two major needs in the improvements and the renovation of Metro Health Hospital and a new Justice Center. We're talking tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. The only way the county would partner with the Cavs, from my understanding, is if there's an identified revenue stream that would pay back whatever bond issue or whatever mechanism was used to fund this with county dollars. What possible kind of funding mechanism could he be talking about? Would it be something that comes from the economic development that is created by what the Cavaliers want to do? And speaking to your larger point about what happens when these teams develop?
Well, let's, I guess, start with one thing. If anything were ever to happen, as has been the case even leading up to this, it would involve substantial, significant private investment. And that would be on top of certainly anything that we currently do, which is already at the highest levels within our league for comparable markets relative to that. As it relates to your point with the county executive, I think he's been made it very clear for, publicly relative to any project in the county about the need to have any a specific dedicated funding source as it relates to that. I think anything that were occur, he set that benchmark to make happen. The Q as a point of reference for the past. For example, the Q, we have one of the highest admissions tax rates in the country, at 8%. And so every ticket that's sold at the Q, there's 8% is of the gross is taken as part of a admissions tax. A portion of that right now has been used in the past for financing relative to the Q. So it's actually a self-generated tax through the building. As an example, when the Cavaliers were playing at Richfield Coliseum, the admissions tax was 0. Or the Palace of Auburn Hills, where the Detroit Pistons play, at 0. And in fact, in any number of communities, that's the preponderance of them, there is no admissions user tax or ticket tax of that sort. So in a lot of respects, for reasons that Tom outlined, that was something that was instituted here or increased in Cleveland as an element that a portion.
It's a user tax.
It's
right?
a user tax,
Yeah.
but using, again, you're asking a question. I can't really speak to, from a public investment perspective, but as an example, the admissions tax, a portion of it has been used as a source of funding for the facility in the past.
Can you say this? What you guys have planned, would it involve knocking down the Q and starting over, or is it something that is more building off of it?
Well, I would say this, and too often times in communities, and it's pretty remarkable if you start to look at it on a national scale. So the Q opened in 1994. If you're looking in Charlotte, Orlando, Miami, in terms of Sacramento, Milwaukee, any number of communities, that question has been posed, and the answer has been to build a new arena. And you have it happening with ballparks and stadiums, even though they're in a comparable age range to the Q. I think the thing that we viewed is how to continue to build and invest off of the existing public asset that occurs, that's happening right now. So and a lot of times those questions, and even in recent times, I'm using Sacramento and Milwaukee as an example, and even north here in Detroit, which is a $700 million arena, those type of questions are significantly, require significantly greater answers because they're $500, $600, $700 million venues. In the case of football stadiums, it may be over $1 billion. Baseball parks closer to $800 million or more.
The Cubs just won the World Series in a ballpark that's over 100 years old.
Hello.
Is
so to your point, your question with that is again, I think our discussions, anything as it relates to, is we've had continuing dialogue with our partners, has been about, really focused on the Q and how do we, in an existing basis, how do we continue to keep that competitive on a long-term basis.
Let me ask a question about ticket prices and the cost of seeing a game. I have a feeling that a lot of people were unable to see either the Cavs or the Indians during the playoffs because those tickets were expensive, very expensive. Yet we have a sin tax that I would argue is somewhat regressive, at least as it relates to cigarettes, perhaps not so much with alcohol. So maybe we're disproportionately taxing lower income folks, and yet those lower income folks don't have a ghost of a chance of seeing a playoff game, or even seeing a regular season game sometimes when you consider what ticket prices are. Yeah, there are some specials, there are some deals. You can get a $13 bleacher seat at Progressive Field, and I think a friend of mine told me that the Cavs, you guys regularly have some $10 seats. Am I right?
Right.
But is it fair to ask the public to pay for something that a good share of the public is never going to get a chance to experience in person? Certainly in TV and reading the paper and following along, and that's something. But in person.
Well, I would say there's a couple things there. You got to start from the top. Is the public-private partnership a fair one? And judging that on a national basis, because that's the only way you can judge it, because we operate on a national basis. If the answer is, and again, by the measure of being able to go through the metrics and investment, if the answer is yes, and ultimately it was judged to be fair back in '94, and has continued on, and the scale is tipped more towards the private sector bearing more of the burden with that. So let's start with that. If we have a lease that is at least judged on a national basis to be public friendly, and then beyond that, as you talk about, and this has been something that our ownership and franchise has been sensitive to, even though we have a very high-performing product right now in terms of the team. I mean, the teams, we won the championship. We have a case here where we have a team that hopefully can compete for championships here for the foreseeable future as it relates to that. Yet our ticket pricing as a whole with the Cavs is at the mid-level of our league. So, and that's because we have this ownership with a very strong sensitivity about making sure that we have those tickets, as you stated, available. In addition to that, with community-based tickets, we do thousands of tickets that we don't charge for to make sure we are able to reach out to the youth and others within the community to go for. And that's above and beyond all the additional tickets that we do with many other entities and assets in the queue, whether it be the Monsters, the Gladiators, the circus, other various activities that take place. Above and beyond that, and I want to speak to the playoffs in particular. So we open the queue for every game, every road game at the queue to have watch parties at the queue, where we did every single thing we do at the queue for a regular season game, and hopefully some of you had a chance to go there, whether it be lights out introductions and the pyro and the Cavalier girls and Scream Team and everything associated with it, everything short of just having the players on the floor, which were unbelievably well received. We charged $5, which 100% of that went back to charitable efforts. So we had $750,000 that was raised for charitable efforts, for different charitable initiatives throughout the community. Where I can't tell you how many people who we heard from who said it was an amazing experience, and they had that opportunity in addition to the games at home, but that opportunity to get there and bring families and a number of people who had never even been to the queue before, who just talked about what a great experience it was in that realm. So I guess the long story short is we do create those opportunities to reach out and touch every sector of the market with all the events and activities that take place here at the queue, and also find ways to be able to connect the community, whether it be the teams at home or on the road as it relates to that. But again, starting back at the very beginning, is the lease agreement a fair one, in terms of this public-private partnership? And then stemming from that, we have ownership that, the thing I'll state with this, driven to bring a championship here, and it's well documented that our ownership in unprecedented fashion in terms of at historical levels, invested in this team tens of millions of dollars into the luxury tax, driven to be able to bring a winner. And you can't measure that on a spreadsheet, and certainly doesn't pencil out on a P&L as far as that's concerned. But I think in terms of Dan's mantra of doing well by doing good and his belief of Cleveland in a market, we have an owner, and I've worked for a number of different owners, who is, I think if we didn't have him in his community, we would seek out an owner like Dan Gilbert to have here in terms of making not only those type of investments, but believing in Cleveland, investing $1.5 billion in downtown Cleveland, 12 businesses, 500,000 team members within the marketplace. And I would encourage you, those who aren't familiar here, see what he's doing in Detroit and even greater levels. And just in terms of believing in live, work, and play 24/7 cities, and how can we be catalytic in those efforts, be at the table to be able to help make that happen. So all these things matter. All these things come together in terms of making impacts, and you can't always measure it on a spreadsheet. But collectively, that economic impact, that development, that connectivity to the community, and what we talked about as far as intangibles in terms of helping change the dialogue on Cleveland, where now we have people on a national, international basis that instead of us being the punchline for jokes on a national basis, are looking at Cleveland. So Forbes magazine, which you referenced, has Cleveland referenced as the hottest city in America. Think about that. 7 years ago, we were referenced to be the most distressed city. We are now the hottest city in America. We all hear about cities like Portland, Oregon. Portland, Oregon's been viewed nationally as this up-and-coming, the go-to, the dynamic city on a national scale. Well, guess what? Who's being viewed as the successor? The Portland Oregonian, which is their version of the Plain Dealer. The headline article is "Cleveland, the next Portland." Think about that.
And would this
That's
have
what's
been
happening.
impossible without public subsidy? Would this have been impossible? That's the question.
Bringing it back to.
I,
Go ahead, Tom.
chime in on this
Yeah.
because I'd like to go back to a point that Peter has made twice, and that relates to this infrastructure is different than other infrastructure because some private sector player, owners of teams, are getting something out of this infrastructure, and the public gets all the benefit out of other public infrastructure. That's just palpably not true. Every road that's out there, some business is beside that road and getting the benefit of bringing their trucks in or out, their product in or out, their people in or out. That sewer that runs down the street here is of great benefit to all of you who live in Cleveland Heights. It isn't at all the case that that infrastructure is substantively any different than the infrastructure that's a ballpark, a stadium, or an arena. It is just that the beneficiary, the private sector beneficiary, is so much more visible when you look at it from a sport point of view as opposed to the owners of the industry down the street, the grocery store down the street. None of those businesses, none of those residences are going to exist without that public infrastructure.
But Mr. Chema, those grocery store owners pay for their own building. The people that own these businesses pay for their own building. They pay their taxes. So I think that's a big difference. And I think our question is, I'm looking at a headline in Cleveland.com showing that the infant mortality rate in Ohio has jumped again. Ohio is still one of the worst states in the union. Cuyahoga County, the absolute worst county in the state. And, we're being told that Quicken Loans Arena is Cleveland's living room. Well, maybe we can take a look at what's going on out in the backyard. I mean, why do we need to be spending this public money on these stadiums? If Dan Gilbert wants to do well by doing good, I would hope that he could provide basic transparency as to why these millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars of public funds continue to be necessary. Why does Dan Gilbert not have to pay for his own building where his business is run out of when everybody else does?
Well, I can explain that if you would like. Sure. Those buildings in and of themselves do not generate enough money ever to pay the capital cost of building them, the ongoing cost of maintaining them, and the cost of repairing them. That's just a fact. Now, this library doesn't either. That's why we subsidize the library. The fact is that the Hershey Chocolate Company does. And so we don't subsidize the Hershey Chocolate Company. But there is no way that a football stadium, as the classic example, where you have 12, 14 events a year, there's no way on God's green earth that that building can generate sufficient revenue to pay those costs. So if you want
billions of dollars, sir, I don't understand that. I don't understand that claim at all.
Yes, their revenues were very high, and so are their expenses. And there is a profit made, and I'm not suggesting that these owners aren't making a profit. And I suppose one could argue about how much profit they ought to make. I don't see that that is
Should that be worked into a lease?
I don't think so.
Could it even be worked into a lease?
I don't know how you could do that. I don't think that that is a possible mechanism. And if you're jealous of the owners making a profit, then you have a problem.
Well, let me ask about this in-tax. That's the mechanism that we chose in this county, primarily to fund up to this point. Are there other ways of public funding that might be more fair, more palatable than a sin tax? Would you not agree that a sin tax is somewhat regressive?
Actually, I have been hearing that since I proposed the sin tax in 1989, and as of this second, I have yet to see any report from any economist, including the academic economists who forever delight in saying that they shouldn't use public monies for these things.
The armchair economist from the Plain Dealer.
I have yet to see a report that shows that this is in fact regressive. It may be, but I hear that as a statement of fact and have yet to see one bit of evidence that in fact is true. The other question, are there other ways? Yeah. We came up with the sin tax idea because it was something that we thought that the public would accept. And they did, and have several subsequent times, both for sports and for the arts and cultural sector. Is it the best way? Probably not. Is it the only way? Certainly not. And other communities do it other ways. There are taxes. Some communities have dipped into general revenue funds, and that tax usually is an income tax or sometimes a property tax. When we did this in the first instance, didn't believe that the public would go for that, and so we didn't suggest that. There are other kinds of use taxes that get to be a piece of the puzzle, but hardly ever are sufficient in and of themselves to do the entire job. There are hotel, motel, bed taxes that, again, can sometimes be a piece of the puzzle, but in and of themselves, they don't usually generate enough revenue to do the entire job. So you find a special dedicated tax, and in our case, it was the tax on beer, wine, cigarettes, and alcohol. Obviously, you would love it if, in fact, you didn't have to have any tax and if you didn't have to have any subsidy. But that's just not economic reality. You can wish that it were, but it isn't. You can't have the buildings if you aren't willing to subsidize them, because the buildings never have paid for themselves.
I would be willing to consider that. And I think the public would be willing to consider that if we could see the numbers proving that this is the case. But instead, we just have folks telling us that it's the case without providing the proof. And I think that's the biggest problem here.
Now Peter Bate has a point there. I mean, and a lot of times when there's public financing involved, like if the federal government extends a grant of some kind, a lot of times there is transparency requirements. Should there be transparency requirements, or is there, if the Cavs did that, Len, and would that send a signal to other teams in the NBA that, hey, well, the Cavs got this much money to spend? Is it a matter of competitive balance, or maintain, trying to be competitive and not giving away what you have?
I mean, well, first of all, these are private businesses, in terms of their operation. You have a
private, or is it public infrastructure? I mean, do you understand the double talk here?
Is this a?
Yes. No, Peter, let him go.
Okay, I appreciate that decorum. Anyways, the first point, these are private businesses, but then you have, again, what takes place on a national basis, and that's the lens you have to look at here. So you have these public facilities, And these public-private partnerships exist across our country with every major professional sport, and actually even with minor league sports as well. So to that extent, they exist. And then you ask, okay, what is a fair arrangement between those two parties, between the public and private sector, okay? And in that case, when you look at the cost associated with the building, and in this case, you know that you can measure it by rent, operations, repair and maintenance, capital expenditures, all those different costs associated with the building, what's a fair arrangement between the two? And then as you look at those aspects, and again, looking at it from our vantage point, we invest more privately than any other comparable market in our league. So by that measure, and by judging by, there's varying levels of that investment, public and private. In all the other cases, it's used more publicly in terms of paying for some or all of those different expenses associated with the building. In our case, we pay more privately than all of those others comparable markets for this public-private partnership. So that's really, if you know, to Tom's point even earlier, that's really what you can measure and compare yourself to other communities about, is this a fair partnership or relationship? And by that, versus maybe, you know, some hypothetical scenario, let's, in terms of dealing with the reality of, here's these relationships and public-private partnerships, and are the teams doing their fair share?
Now, it's hard to make an apples-to-apples comparison, though, I mean, because every community is different, right? I mean, Dan Gilbert's going to put a lot of private money into the Q, into the Cavs, and into the whole experience down there. But then again, he's got a casino. He's now got Tower City. All the investments that he makes are going to probably feed off the others. So you know, it would behoove him. I mean, I'm not, you know, I mean, he may be very civic-minded. I'm not trying to suggest that he's not. But there also is a self-interest there that may not exist in other communities. And you also look at a place like, Chicago or San Francisco, areas that are much significantly wealthier than we are. And are you saying that the percentage of public investment that we make in Cleveland is equal to those? And if it's not, I mean, I think.
No, I think maybe because to help give you context there, Cleveland is not a comparable market to Chicago or to New York, LA. Comparable markets are mid to smaller markets. We're the 20th market in our league, 19th market, you know, even just on so when you're looking at comparable markets, you're looking at markets like Milwaukee and Sacramento and well, Pittsburgh would be example, or otherwise. These are markets of similar size, nature, population base, and otherwise, you know, versus say you know, what we call large markets.
So you're saying our public investment in comparison with those is less.
The private, whether way public investment less or private investment more as it relates to those mid to smaller markets in that trajectory, our investment in terms of the public-private partnership of this public venue is at a greater level than those. Yes, privately.
Peter, is the public going to get an opportunity?
Yeah, they are. I thought we were going to have some questions brought up, but go ahead.
I want to ask Len 2 questions. I could ask 100, but 2 questions. Why don't you pay any property taxes? Most of the money would go to the Cleveland schools.
Well, first of all, we do pay the property taxes. So, I'm sorry, we do. So the property taxes, there's property tax for as it relates to the for the Gateway complex, and those property taxes, which were previously paid for by Gateway, and now paid for between the Cavaliers and the Indians for that.
But you guys took the naming rights.
Again, that's part of an overall lease arrangement. So
You exchanged one benefit for the other.
well, again, sir, just to look at this, you have expenses associated with operating these buildings, and there's economics that are associated with that. But then it gets to, first of all, it gets down to what's the lease arrangement and who is investing what. And as it relates to, and we can take this and go to any other of these comparable market communities and go through the same. Well, you have to, because we're on a national landscape. Well, so do we, but we're operating on a national landscape with these teams. And so as it relates to the queue and the opportunities associated with it, but in the investments in the queue, we are putting more in privately than any of these comparable markets. And in those cases as well, there are, whether it be selling suites or tickets or sponsorships, those exist as well. But then as a backdrop to that is, what is the investment in these public facilities? And again, sir, we are investing more than any other comparable market in the country.
From the beginning. I will tell you what was promised. You promised 28,000 good-paying jobs. You promised neighborhood housing for the homeless. You promised $15 million a year for the school children. You give them nothing. You promised revenue for hospitals and for county clinics. You gave them nothing. You promised energy assistance for the elderly. You gave them nothing. You promised no tax abatement. You take full tax abatement. You have tax exemption, worse than tax abatement. And $250,000, that's how much they paid. They paid, the Indians paid. That's how much the Browns paid. $250,000 for 30 years, never a penny more.
Rollo, I don't know where you're getting your information. I was there. But
All right.
when we put the gateway in place, there was no tax exemption and there was no tax abatement.
No, you got it after.
All right, let me take.
No.
You lied to the public.
I don't know what
and then
happened
you got.
we're not going to
in
get confrontation.
2004, but I can tell you when the leases changed. I don't know. I wasn't involved in that, but I
No,
can
you
tell
weren't.
you between 1990 and 2004, there was no tax abatement. It's on.
Louis, let me take another question from the audience. Will sports franchises continue to grow in value, and by how much? And Len, maybe you can tell us how much the Cavs are worth now and how much they were worth, say, when Dan took it over. I'm sure there's probably been some kind of an accounting done by somebody where they rate franchises.
Yeah, I mean, you really can't get to that point in terms of what a franchise is worth until you actually sell and understand what the market will bear relative to that. Suffice to say, sports franchises have gone in a positive direction, as it's been with the Cavs or all the, as you look largely on a national landscape.
But could you put a dollar figure on the value?
Yeah, again, couldn't. That's really more of a judgment of when we have an owner who's not looking to sell; he's looking to continue to operate and invest a team. I guess that's a question that you can have speculation about that, but it's more a matter of when a team actually sells. Do you really realize or understand what that is?
Should there be a domed facility in this town someday? And obviously the Cavs, that doesn't really play into the Cavs so much, but Tom?
I don't think so. I was glad that we didn't do a dome back in 94 or 90 when we started the project. You get so little added benefit from putting a very, very expensive roof on a building the size of a football stadium or a baseball park that I don't think it's worth it. Our climate is not that bad. It was 70 degrees today. I know we have rain. I know, it's Cleveland. It is what it is. I don't think we should have a dome. I don't think it would be a good investment of dollars to do that.
And all right, let me see here. Can Cleveland continue to support three major sports? Peter?
It seems very clear that it can, and I think that if we continue, or if we could get the basic transparency that I think the taxpayers deserve when it comes to these franchises and public subsidies for them, we would start to see, and if it starts in Cleveland or if it starts somewhere else, it would surely spread, that I think you'd start to see, and you already do see, that these leagues share revenues. These leagues are tremendously profitable. These leagues take in billions of dollars in profit every year, and to varying degrees, they share revenue. And I believe the NFL is the leader in that regard in terms of distributing that revenue equally. But I think that the TV market is clearly here. The eyeballs are clearly here. The hearts are clearly here. Cleveland is a great sports town with great sports fans. And I think if Clevelanders hold their leaders and the team owners accountable, there is no reason why we shouldn't be a three-sport team, a three-sport town. And, part of that, I think, would have to include revenue sharing, I think, if we're going to be equitable about it. I think that you see a lot of the money coming from the TV deals, and you're talking about major national television.
But the leagues would have to amend their agreements on that. That's nothing that an individual city could take
Well, I think
upon
the
itself.
conversation would start with in an individual city, and it would go from there. But I do think that the leagues should be a part of this conversation. There's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't be. I mean, it was the league that realized that it was not a tenable proposition to have Cleveland without the Cleveland Browns. And it was the league that made sure that the Browns were brought right back here as soon as Modell and that whole disaster went down. So I think that the leagues are definitely a critical participant in this conversation.
And don't the leagues, Tom, kind of put pressure on individual teams too? If they've got a stadium that's not up to par, it's happened in a couple places just recently where they want them to do something, and that could, the owner can then maybe leverage that a little bit to get some public dollars.
It is certainly the case that the leagues want all of the teams to be profitable. The league does better when all of the members do better. So that's a given. And if a league sees that a building is holding back the profitability of the individual team, they might put some pressure on. But it really is pretty much a myth. In the 20 years that I've been involved in this, I have not seen leagues pushing teams to move out of communities. In fact, quite the opposite is the case. They are usually trying to put pressure on the team to stay in the community. You hear all kinds of stuff from people who I think make it up, but when you talk to league officials, certainly Major League Baseball did not want the Cleveland Indians to move out of Cleveland in the late 80s, early 90s. They were hoping that we could, in fact, find a way to make that team profitable and viable going forward. And I think that's generally the case. There are a lot of different issues. Sports franchises are, while they're a private business, they really are very attuned to a cabal because while they fight and are horribly competitive with each other on the playing surface, whether it be a field or a court, they really need all of those members of their league to be successful. So on one side, they're competitive. Economically, they can't be, because if a whole bunch of franchises fail, the others won't have anyone to play. They won't have the same kind of cachet in the public imagination, and ultimately, you can't have a league of one. So you need to have a circumstance in sports leagues where there is not only competition on the field, but where you've structured the economics of this to allow for the great bulk of the members of your league to be successful.
It sounds like each community has to kind of do what it must to fit within that structure. But I tell you what, we got 4 minutes left. Okay, so let each of you just take a minute and a half and just kind of sum up your thoughts on the issue of public financing for these sports facilities. Len, would you go first?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for the conversation tonight. Great dialogue. I'll just, I give Cleveland a tremendous amount of credit. you had touched on the point about being able to support 3 teams, and I think this market has been a model across the country in terms of how to do that right, to have fair public-private partnerships, to be able to create, public assets that have been able to serve the community with the teams, with having those strategically located downtown, to be able to help promote, live, work, and play a 24/7 city, which we're very unique in having all 3 strategically placed downtown, which is not always the case in the economic core. And I think as you time being the judge, if you go from 1994 to now, it's been exemplary in terms of the decisions that were made and the partnerships that were forged with the teams to be able to create a setting where everyone can work together to create a positive impact. And again, I think giving credit as well, and having leases that are on a national scale with comparable markets, within comparable markets that are certainly very public friendly, also is a point of responsible stewardship that this community is endeavored on, to be able to bring those partnerships together. And we look forward to these type of dialogues going forward to make sure that that's still the case.
All right, thanks, Lynn. Peter?
I think that we should all be able to love Cleveland sports teams and agree that Cleveland is a 3-sport town, while also maintaining the default position that if the owners will continue to take 100% of the profits to the tune of presumably hundreds of millions of dollars a year. We do have publicly available numbers from the NFL, and we know the Green Bay Packers, who do have to publish their financials because they're a publicly held company, earned $155 million in 2014. So if we are talking about these owners deriving 100% of the profits, I think we need to be very skeptical of the proposition that the public should be paying any of their costs. And again, that conversation simply has to start with complete transparency, because without transparency, there cannot be fairness. And I think we should resist the notion that we can be told what a fair arrangement is without knowing what kind of profit is being taken out. So I don't believe that specific issue has been addressed in any substance in this panel, but I do think that it is a question that we should continue to ask, and I think that only good things will come from demanding accountability and transparency on this point. And I do thank you for allowing me to participate.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Tom, last word.
I'm a proponent of public financing to some degree, some significant degree of these facilities. I think they are items of public infrastructure, and that the public is better off having the opportunity to have some measure of control of these facilities and how they're used by having a stake in the facilities. The percentage is going to vary from community to community. How this is done, the measure, the type of subsidy is going to vary from community to community. But as a general matter, I think that it makes great sense for the public to participate in contributing to the existence of these kinds of structures, so that we can have not only the economic benefit from them, but also the social, civic, emotional, intellectual, architectural, you just name it. There are just so many benefits that flow from having these kind of facilities in our community. And we are lucky this year that you see that in such dramatic relief with the kinds of events that have taken place at the Q and at Progressive Field, and hopefully that will continue in the future. I hope that on another subject, that we can begin to grow our community again, so that the issue of whether we are a big enough community to have 3 teams is not an issue, so that we have more resources, public and private, to attack some of the underlying problems that Peter mentioned that are not being appropriately addressed right now. It's really, really hard when you're arguing over slicing the pie and what slice a stadium gets versus what slice a healthcare institution gets. It would be so much better if we could increase the size of that pie, and the only way I think you can do that is by having growth in the community, and we've unfortunately not seen that since the 1970s.
A little better, I'd say, in the last few years. But anyway, that's the last word. All right, thank you all very much.